Can you read old handwriting, and could you understand Old English if you only had a time machine and could go back and hear it? Well, no need for a time machine when you have history calling, because in this video we're going to answer those questions by working our way backwards from the 19th to the 11th centuries, using documents including a request for a Christmas meal at a workhouse, Jane Austen's will, the records of a witchcraft accusation, a desperate letter to her sister written by the future Elizabeth I, arrangements for the funeral of a queen, a sweet little note from Lady Margaret Beaufort to her son Henry VII, and many more. There truly is something for everyone here. Paleography is the study of old handwriting and/or the manuscripts that handwriting is written on, and it's one of the core skills of most historians, unless perhaps they are studying very modern history. You'll generally be good at paleography for a particular time period, the one which you study. So in my case, my strength is in the handwriting of the mid-17th century onwards, as I never really looked at anything earlier than that in my university or postdoctoral studies. This video will demonstrate how differently letters were constructed the further back in time we go, and how drastically spelling, grammar and word use has changed as we move from modern English, anything from about 1700 up to today, to early modern English, which covers roughly 1500 to 1700, then Middle English, about 1150 to 1500, and finally Old English, which was spoken before the Norman Conquest of 1066, then died out within about a century of that date. The ranges I've given here are from the Oxford English Dictionary and are just guidelines, not hard and fast rules. You'll see all four versions of English in this video. For the rest of our time today, I'm going to show you a manuscript, or sometimes just part of it to save time, and while I give you a little bit of background on it, you're free to pause the video to see if you could read it. I'm then going to tell you what it says, though I won't always give a complete transcript as it won't always be needed, and I'll point out some of the writing and spelling quirks that are particular to that era if appropriate. I'm not going to keep telling you to pause the video here as I think that would get annoying. This is all just for fun, of course, and is not a full-blown paleography course. If you do want to learn more about this topic, however, I've left a link to a free course from Cambridge University in the description box below. Let's start with a nice easy one from the end of the 19th century. This letter was written by Wilbur Wright, one of the famous Wright brothers who are generally credited with building and flying the world's first airplane in North Carolina in 1903. He is writing to the Smithsonian Institution 4.5 years before that event, on the 30th of May 1899, discussing his belief in the ability of humans to invent powered flight. His handwriting is quite neat. He uses cursive script, meaning joined up writing, and the language he employs is a little more formal than we might hear today, but still readily understood. The grammar matches our own, with the possible exception of the semicolon after "Dear Sirs" at the beginning, as I think we would be more likely to use a comma. So let's take the first 3 sentences and see how you did with it. Wilbur writes, "Dear Sirs, I have been interested in the problem of mechanical and human flight ever since, as a boy, I constructed a number of bats of various sizes after the style of Cayley's and Pinaude's machines. My observations since have only convinced me more firmly that human flight is possible and practicable. It is only a question of knowledge and skill, just as in all acrobatic feats." I hope you did okay with that letter, but there were things, even in just those few sentences, which gave me trouble. The word problem has been badly written due to a slip of the pen on the R in it, and you just have to try to work things like that out based on the context of the sentence. The word bats wasn't one I expected in this context either, and the first letter doesn't really look like a lowercase b. In those instances, you need to look for the same letter appearing at the start of other words to help you figure out what it is and get you into the swing of reading a particular hand. In this case, we can see B's at the beginning of the words bean and boy as well. So we learn from this that that is the way in which Wilbur wrote that letter at the start of a word. Finally, the name Pinodes was also tricky, and in fact I got it from an online transcript, because it's a proper name and not something you would read in the normal course of life. The way in which Wright constructs the N and the U is also so similar that you could be forgiven for thinking it was Penans. In these cases, sometimes you have to just take your best guess and hope that your research into the writer or the event you're studying will reveal later on what that author was talking about. Okay, let's move on and jump back in time to 1852 and to an English workhouse, the dreaded place where only the most destitute would go in Victorian times, and which was closer to a prison than anything else. This letter is from a clerk of the workhouse to its board of governors, and the author's style of handwriting betrays, I think, the fact that he will have written a great many letters. With a little patience it is legible, but it's certainly not as clear as the previous example. It is an italic script, meaning it slants to one side, and quite spiky. This, I found, is typical of this era, and it's simply the way he will have been taught to write at school. As we go back in time, you'll see handwriting change with each century, and that is generally attributable to the different education styles and standards of the day. So what does our workhouse worker say? Well, it's a letter from the 17th of December, though the modern rule in Britain of putting the day first, then the month, was not yet in place here, and it reads, "My lords and gentlemen," and then there's a small line like a hyphen rather than a comma, so you're seeing some changes in grammar from what we're used to. "A subscription has been entered into in Mansfield to afford a treat of roast beef and plum pudding to the inmates of the workhouse on Christmas Day next, instead of the usual diet of the day, according to Article 107 of the General Consolidated Order. It was represented to the guardians at their meeting yesterday that great inconvenience would arise from the treat being given on the Christmas Day, and I was instructed to request that you would be pleased to sanction it being given on a subsequent day, viz. December 31st or January 1st. I have the honour to be, my lords and gentlemen, your obedient servant." There are a few additional things to note here which will become more common the further back we go. First, did you see the random inclusion of capital letters in places we wouldn't use them today? In the 21st century, they should only appear at the start of sentences and on proper nouns, but those rules weren't as well established at the time this gentleman will have learnt to write, and you'll see the use of capitals become more and more erratic as we move on. Second, he does still use paragraph breaks. Again, they become less frequent as we go back in time, as the rules around writing which we are so used to today evaporate, along with any standardized education system. The clerk's spelling is the same as modern times, but don't get comfortable with that. Standardized spelling is a luxury we won't enjoy much longer, as we head back towards the 18th century. He also uses an ampersand in place of the word and, which I think we generally only see in typed documents now. I was certainly never taught to use it in handwritten items, though occasionally I might use a plus sign. Finally, you'll note the abbreviations he uses at the end of the letter, OBST. Not only were such abbreviations commonplace for people who wrote so many letters, so too was this very polite and formal way of ending such missives. It's the forerunner of our modern "yours sincerely" or even "best wishes." How do I know it's short for "obedient servant"? Because that was such a commonplace phrase to end letters with in the past that once you've read enough of them, you just get used to it. To see how fast handwriting was changing, we need only go back another 35 years, to the last will and testament of English author Jane Austen. Here we see that the italic handwriting, ampersands, and the random use of capital letters are present, but paragraph breaks are not. There's something else I want to point out to you in Jane's handwriting though, and that's the use of the long S. You can see it only in words where two S's are next to each other, in Cassandra, which was her sister's name, and possessed, and it's just what it sounds like. It's the letter S, but elongated so much that it looks like a lowercase f, and in fact it's often misread as an F by people not used to older handwriting. It's one of the defining traits of early modern English hands, and so as we move further back, you'll see it used more, and not always where there is a double S. I'm not going to read out her whole will now, but here's a transcript if you'd like to pause and look it over. Before we go back further, if you're enjoying this content, please remember to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell on so that YouTube lets you know when I upload. You can also find me on Patreon, where I share perks, including early access to ad-free videos and mini podcasts, and on Amazon, where I have a storefront which highlights some great history-themed products. Both are linked in the description box below, as is my Instagram account. Now let's jump back about a century to 1714 and to the death of Queen Anne, last of the Stuart monarchs, because no, I'm not including the Jacobites. Here we see a document outlining the arrangements for her funeral procession by showing the order in which people will process and how they will be arranged around the body, which will be in the centre as shown by the boxed-in text in the middle of the page. The royal official who wrote this had gorgeous handwriting, and they obviously received an excellent education during the later half of the 17th century. So what do we need to think about when reading a document from this time period? Well, first of all, the rules of modern grammar are almost non-existent. There are capital letters at the start of sentences, but they also appear anywhere else the author felt like using them, and not always on the same word. See the word purple in the centre box, which sometimes has a capital, sometimes not. Commas exist and are used far more than in modern language because full stops and new sentences are so much less frequent. Again, this is most notable in the centre box, which is one long run-on sentence, reading: "The royal body, carried by 10 or 12 yeomen of the guard, covered with a large pall of purple velvet, and lined with purple silk, with a fine holland sheet, adorned with 10 large escutcheons of the imperial arms painted on satin under a canopy of purple velvet." We're also seeing a lot more abbreviations here and elsewhere in the document than we would be used to today, and more too than what we've seen in documents from later years. In words like lined, which we spell with an E near the end, this author instead uses an apostrophe. With gets shortened down to a W with the TH in superscript to indicate an abbreviation, and in other places Lord becomes LD and Archbishop loses some of its later letters with the P again put into superscript to indicate the shortening. These are all classic signs of something written by someone who learned to write in the 18th century or earlier. Another telltale sign is the phonetic spellings we're starting to see creeping in, such as in the words escutcheon and satin. But the author of the rules for Anne's burial may have been better educated than most, and is starting to show early indications of standardized spelling, because it's still very close to modern usage. Many others living at this time did not display this trait. Here is a piece of a letter written in 1722, for instance, from Queen Anne's maternal aunt, Lady Frances Keatley, to her daughter, Catherine O'Brien, who was then living in Ireland. As you can see from the transcript, they are discussing the possible marriage of Catherine's son, Sir Edward O'Brien, 2nd Baronet, to a Miss Mary Hickman, and Lady Frances's spelling is very phonetic in places, just a few of which are highlighted here. Back to the royal funeral arrangements. The big thing to note in this document is a tiny little word which appears several times. It's ye, and it means the. But the thing to know is that when you see words like this, the letter Y followed by one other letter, often in superscript, the Y is standing in for the letters TH. So ye becomes the, YM becomes them, YT means that, and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that the word the, or any of the others just mentioned, weren't used as well. You can see the on this document too. It's just that you had other options as well if you wanted to avail of them. We can see handwriting styles changing too. Look at the lowercase r's. Sometimes they look like S's or Z's. Sometimes they look like modern R's. There aren't any long S's here, but they were commonplace at this time, so don't forget about them. Now let's go even earlier. This document is from 1634 and provides details of an accusation of witchcraft. We now have minimal grammar compared to nowadays, although being a legal document, this is better than a lot of what you might see. It has paragraphs, for instance, whereas in private letters, people would be less likely to bother, either because they simply hadn't been taught to use paragraphs or to save paper. The handwriting is still a little bit slanted, but the way in which some of the letters are formed and the spelling are starting to become quite foreign to us. On top of long S's, we see double F's where we would never use them, and the letter H looks more like a capital E. As we've now moved into early modern English, we're also starting to see some words which we don't use anymore, or at least they don't have the same meaning nowadays. If we look near the bottom of the document, we get an example of this in a sentence which says, "And that she is in her conscience persuaded that Wilkinson and his wife, now in prison, are not witches, nor many others who stand now condemned for witchcraft, because he daily prays and reads, and seems to her to be a godly man, as do divers of the rest." Now, in this case, I think that although we read the word diverse at the end of this sentence, what the writer is actually going for is divers, and they've just put an E on the end because there was no standardized spelling at this point. Divers didn't mean people who swim underwater though, but rather many, or an associated group. So, for example, I have divers YouTube followers who live in divers parts of the world. Its meaning can overlap with the word diverse, but it's a little more complicated than that. Given how long this document is, I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but here is the full transcript with the spelling modernised if you'd like to have a look. As you'll see, I think if you were confronted with these people today, you would still be able to communicate with them verbally very easily. No doubt you'd find some of their sentence constructions a bit strange and vice versa, but it wouldn't be a huge problem. Early modern English isn't too far away from modern, at least when you hear it spoken. From here on out, things get pretty tough for a non-medievalist like me, but it does depend a bit on the quality of the writer's handwriting. Here's a snippet of a famous letter the future Elizabeth I wrote to her sister Mary while Mary had the 20-year-old locked up in March 1554 on suspicion of treason and was about to have her removed to the Tower of London. Elizabeth was pleading her innocence, and the letter is called the Tide Letter because the tide in the River Thames changed while she was writing it, which meant that she couldn't be shipped off to the Tower just yet, though she only bought herself a few hours. Despite the great pressure she was under, Elizabeth had been taught how to write in the most beautiful italic script, and it really shows here. In spite of the non-standardized spellings, which include putting the letter E on the ends of words where we would no longer use it, plus the long S's, random capitals, and the abbreviations, note the M missing from the word from, which has been replaced by a little dash over the O, this is, to me at least, very easy to read. It's the end of the letter and says, "I humbly crave but only one word of answer from yourself. Your Highness's most faithful subject, that hath been from the beginning and will be to my end, Elizabeth." Elizabeth's mother was, of course, Anne Boleyn, and like her daughter, she is famed for her great intelligence and education. When it comes to handwriting, though, her daughter had her beat, for Anne's penmanship, which she will have learned in the early 1500s and perfected during her later childhood and early adulthood in modern-day Belgium and France, wasn't a patch on her girls, though I suppose we must say that Elizabeth's did deteriorate in later life. She didn't always have that gorgeous italic script. If you think that the problem was just that Anne's lettering got worse in later life too, though, then take a look at this letter, written in very bad French when she was about 13. Her French, by the way, would later become excellent, but she was only learning it at this stage. We can see that the way in which she formed her letters was tough for us to read, even when she was a youngster, and she was evidently taught quite a different style to her daughter. I'm not going to get into the details of this letter here, as it isn't in English, but if you see my video on when Anne was born, I do go into it in depth there, as this letter is really the key to understanding her age. Despite the differences in how they were taught to write, we still see a lot of the same traits in the two women's writing, showing that there wasn't too much of a change from one generation to the next at this point. To demonstrate what I mean, let's now turn to a letter written by Anne in the late 1520s, when she would have been in her late 20s, and whose recipient was possibly Thomas Cranmer. There is no grammar here. Unlike Elizabeth, she doesn't even put capital letters on her own name or the names of other people or places. There are no full stops or paragraph breaks either, and we have abbreviations, long S's, seemingly backwards R's, and as you may have noticed in Elizabeth's letter too, many of the places where we would put the letter I have the letter Y instead, like in this little phrase at the start, which says gift of this. The spelling is highly phonetic in other ways too. Like her daughter, we see E's on the ends of words we wouldn't use it on anymore, like effect, self, and bound, which also has a W in place of the U. Meanwhile, were is spelt as we would spell war, while ways looks like wise. Like Elizabeth, she omits the letter M sometimes, as in the word humble, and indicates that it has been cut by a little dash over the letter U. You're seeing this type of abbreviation in both letters, written decades apart, because it was such a common thing to do in the 1500s, but of course, we don't do it anymore. You might notice something similar in other words too, like your, which is spelt Y-O with a little superscript R above it and no indication of the U, perhaps because Anne just didn't spell it with a U even at the best of times. We've already seen some now extinct words in the 17th century witchcraft allegations I showed you, but as we get further back in time, that issue only becomes more pronounced, and Anne's letter is a good example of this. This once and future queen uses multiple words which we would never hear now. Some are easy for us to understand because they are so similar to their still popular modern equivalents, like howbeit, hath, and standeth. Others are positively archaic, such as vowson, which basically means church patronage and, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, quote, is last recorded around the late 1500s. Nevertheless, if I read this letter out to you, I think you'll realise that we could still understand Anne if she was talking to us, and probably, albeit with some difficulty, make ourselves understood verbally as well. Here's what she says, and while I can't put little dashes over letters, this transcript is otherwise correct. My lord, in my most humble ways, I thank your grace for the gift of this benefice for Master Barlow. Howbeit, this standeth to none effect, for it is made for Tonbridge, and I would have it, if your pleasure were so, for Sonbridge. For Tonbridge is in my lord my father's gift, be, that should probably be read as by in modern English, a vowson that he hath, and is not yet void. I do trust that your grace will grant him Sondridge, and considering the pain that he hath taken, I do think that it shall be very well bestowed. And in so doing, I reckon myself much bound to your grace. For all those that hath taken pain in the king's matter, that's a little reference to his attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, it shall be my daily study to imagine all the ways that I can devise to do them service and pleasure. And thus I make an end, sending you again the letter that you sent me, thanking your grace most humbly for the pain that you take for to write to me, assuring you that next the king's letter there is nothing that can rejoice me so much, with the hand of her that is most bound to be your most humble and obedient servant, Anne Boleyn. And then she adds a little postscript. My lord, I beseech your grace with all my heart to remember the parson of Honey Lane for my sake shortly. Hopefully, now that you've heard it spoken, you agree with me that it's not too difficult to understand Anne's meaning, but you can let me know below if you still think that the English of the early 1500s is too far away from our modern usage to be easily followed. Something we don't see in this particular letter, but which was also common enough at the time, was to use the letter V instead of U and vice versa, and to swap over V and W. If I show you this letter, written by Anne's sister-in-law, Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland, to Thomas Wolsey in 1517, you can see what I mean. Margaret uses V in place of W many times here, including in the opening line when she says, My Lord Cardinal, in my most hearty ways I recommend me to you and would be glad to hear from you. Here we see wise instead of wise, which we would substitute for ways, and would instead of would. I'm not going to go through the rest of the letter, as this little section is all I need to make this point, but please do also note the lack of commas and full stops. Time to push back into the 15th century, and here I have two letters to show you. The first is from Lady Margaret Beaufort to her son Henry VII on the 14th of January at some point during his reign, so it dates to between 1486 and 1509. It includes quite a sweet little note at the very beginning to her son, who she calls "my own sweet and most dear king and all my worldly joy." At this point, we're looking at someone taught to write in about the 1450s, and her handwriting, spelling, and sometimes her word choice make her letter almost indecipherable to anyone not trained in medieval paleography. She does display a little grammatical trait which is useful though, which is that she puts vertical lines in places where we would now have commas or full stops. This was not a universal practice, even within the royal family. Margaret's granddaughter Margaret Tudor didn't employ it, for instance, but it is something I also noted in our second letter from this period. This was written on the 12th of October 1483 and was from Richard III to John Russell, Chancellor of England. The first part of it was written by a secretary, but where you see the handwriting change, that's where Richard himself comes in. As you can see, his writing is much bigger and less neatly formed than the secretary's. The secretary, though, uses little lines just as Margaret did as a form of grammar. This is a professional writer who obviously had a good education, and nerd that I am, I just find it fascinating that there clearly was an appreciation for the need for grammar at this time, yet with no standardized education system, you only see some people, like Margaret and this secretary, actually employing it. Richard doesn't do it, for instance. His addition to the letter is just one big run-on sentence. Other than this grammar note, there's nothing really new to point out to you here. The way in which the letters are formed is increasingly different to modern traits, and the spelling is more and more phonetic, giving a little insight into people's accents. The third word, for instance, is father, spelt F-A-D-R-E. Time, though, to move on. We now find ourselves with a document written between about 1400 and 1410, so very much in Middle English. This is an extract of one of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, specifically The Knight's Tale. This beautiful illuminated manuscript will have been written by a professional, so the handwriting you see here is the best of the best for the time period. As we now expect, there are no spelling or grammar rules, but a lot of what we've seen in later generations was in place already here, like the preference for the letter Y over I, and the very different ways of forming letters, which is especially noticeable, to me at least, on the letter R. The handwriting is also much spikier than we would have nowadays, and I think we have to consider that this is because straight lines and spikes were easier to accomplish with a quill than rounded shapes. We also see the beautiful italic script that was still popular a century and a half later when Elizabeth I was learning to write, and which was really the mark of a top-notch education, but again, also easier to achieve with a quill. We simply couldn't do it nowadays with a biro, as it requires a slanted nib. Could we understand this if it was spoken to us, though? Well, most of it, I think, but if we went back in that time machine, I suspect even verbal communication would be getting pretty challenging by this point, as there are a lot of words and pronunciations that are long since extinct in the English language. The title and the first 6 lines of the manuscript say, "Here beginneth the Knight's Tale. Whilom, which means once, as old stories tellen us, there was a duke that hight, meaning was called, Theseus. Of Athens he was lord and governor, and in his time switch, meaning such, a conqueror. That greater was there none under the sun, full many a rich country had he won." This is written in rhyming couplets, by the way, which you possibly didn't get as I had to keep stopping to translate the obsolete words into modern English. But if you look at the transcript, you should be able to pick up on the fact that each set of 2 lines rhyme with one another. So we're now over 600 years in the past. Written English is barely recognisable to us thanks to vast differences in handwriting styles, spelling and grammar, and even verbal communication would be very hard given the different accents and the use of words we no longer have in our vocabulary. To try to take you back further in the manuscript record is very tough, as there are fewer and fewer such documents available, and very few of those which we do have are written in English. Things like the Domesday Book, which you may have heard of, tend to be in Latin or French, as those were the languages of governance at this point. Furthermore, of the few which are in English, I struggle to get copyright-free or Creative Commons images of them. So for our next example, I'm going to have to show you a later printed version of this item, which is an excerpt from Robert of Gloucester's Chronicle, written in the late 13th century, i.e. the 1200s. Even without seeing the handwritten version, this gives you a flavour of how the English language continues to change as we go backwards, for we are at this stage even deeper into the Middle English phase. It's now very hard to follow what's being said, and even the alphabet is changing, for some of the letters Robert will have been familiar with are no longer used by us. In particular, you can see one called a thorn, which looks a bit like a P, and which has long since been replaced in English by TH, though I believe it still exists in the Icelandic language. I can't imagine I'd be able to carry on a conversation with an English person at this stage, though I might pick up some of the words they were saying. To finish up, I'm going to show you just one more document to demonstrate how completely the language has changed over the past 1,000 years. This is a page from the epic poem Beowulf. The manuscript was written between 975 and 1025 AD, and so it predates the Norman conquest. This is very much Old English, and although written up by a professional who has composed their letters very clearly and included good gaps between lines, I don't think any lay person would associate this with what we call English today. Only a specialist would know what they are looking at. I'm not even going to attempt to read it to you because I can't. I don't know how to pronounce what I'm saying, and it wouldn't mean anything to me and probably not anything to most, if not all of you. However, here is the transcript for you to look at if you so desire. So how did you do with this video? Were you able to read any of the documents, or was it all double Dutch to you? Let me know in the comments below at what point you felt the increasingly antiquated English I've showed you today became too difficult to manage, or if you sailed through the whole thing and think that people who can't read the original Beowulf are wimps who just aren't trying hard enough. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and if you want to learn more about some of the people discussed today, try one of these videos next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.